So last week I was out of town. I was downtown running some errands, and I got thirsty. Wouldn't you know it, I looked around, but I couldn't find a well anywhere. Conveniently, however, there was a little restaurant on the side of the road. So I went in and got myself some water. And as I sat in the restaurant having a drink, I looked around myself and I noticed the name of the restaurant. And the name was Imperfect. Now, I have to say that puzzled me a bit because I couldn't imagine who in the right mind would name a restaurant Imperfect. It's kind of like saying, come on in, food's okay, it's mediocre, it's imperfect. I couldn't figure that one out. So I was kind of thinking about this, and I looked at the name again, and I realized that the first two letters were lowercase, and the P was capitalized. So if you read it in that way, it reads, I'm perfect, which, is a pretty high claim to make for a fast food joint. I didn't try their food, but I doubt it was perfect. But I couldn't help but think, isn't this so much like our world? We vacillate between these two extremes, don't we? Marketers always want to push perfection upon us and try to show us ways in which we could be perfect. But at the end of the day, we know that we are all imperfect in one way or another. Well, today's gospel reading contrasts last week's almost perfectly. And it reminds us that there is no such thing as human perfection. So last Sunday we read from John chapter 3, and we heard the story of Nicodemus. Now, Nicodemus was a Pharisee, a very well-respected teacher of the law. He came to Jesus at night to talk theology specifically, and he refers to him deferentially as Rabbi. Everything's good from the outside, but at the end of that conversation, you get that there's this internal struggle. He doesn't quite get what it is that Jesus is talking about. By contrast, today, we hear of an unnamed woman, a Samaritan, an enemy of the people of Israel, who meets Jesus in the middle of the day and questions him and refers to him more or less saying, why do you dare talk to me? Who are you? Well, she hadn't heard of him, and truly it was a fair question to ask because historically Jews and Samaritans don't get along. The animosity was so strong that most Jews, if they were traveling like Jesus from kind of Galilee to Jerusalem, would go the long way around the Jordan River, just so they could avoid Samaria. But if we remember back to last week, in that conversation with Nicodemus, Jesus had told him, we all know this, John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he sent his only Son, not to condemn the world, but in order that the world might be saved through him. So to live out his faith in action, Jesus takes the shortcut to Jerusalem. He's going to travel into the world to love the world, even if that means going to Samaria. And so it's here at midday that they stop by a well. Now, conveniently, the disciples try to go into town to find something to eat, and Jesus remains by the well, hoping, I'm sure, that someone will come by to give him something to quench his thirst. And so it's in this perfectly imperfect moment that this lone woman comes by with a bucket. And the two begin a conversation, and each one challenging the other. Now, biblically, just so you know, wells are where lovers meet. Think about Rachel and Jacob, Moses and Zipporah, Isaac and Rachel. Yet in their conversation, Jesus tells the woman that this isn't going to happen this day because he knows that she's not single. She has been married 5 times before, and the man she's with now isn't her husband. Now, many people in her day probably judged her for this, and many people in our day continue to judge her for this. They tend to focus on her sexual past, and too often she's described as a promiscuous woman or some kind of harlot, which I think is completely missing the point of this conversation. Remember those words from John 3:16, 17? Jesus came to love the world and not to condemn the world. And he doesn't issue any words of condemnation against her. We might have, but he has never done that. And truthfully, the fault should not be on her for her failed marriages. Because in Jesus' day, a woman couldn't get a divorce and couldn't divorce her husband even if she wanted to. She didn't have that kind of power. So that means that the men she had married had either died, which would have been heartbreaking, or they had left her. Now, one could say maybe she was adulterous, but again, think back a little bit about other biblical stories about the adulterous woman who Jesus came across a few weeks ago who was being stoned to death for being caught in adultery. If she had really 5 husbands and it was adultery, she probably would be dead. Another reason, however, for her possible divorce was perhaps she was barren. That was a very legitimate reason for someone to divorce a wife back in those days. Whatever it was, 5 failed marriages would be hard to fathom. But we got to give her some credit, don't we? For keeping going out to look for love and getting married again and again. She knew in her time she needed a man to live in this patriarchal society, and she did what she needed to do. She was a survivor. But surviving is not the same as thriving. Having your spouse die or constantly being rejected or left, and now she's in a relationship where she is not even deemed as worthy of the sanctity of marriage, imagine what that would do to your soul. And I wonder if in this conversation, Jesus sees too her soul's desire, to what she thirsts for most, which might be a desire to be loved, wholly and deeply, just for who she is, not for what she might be able to deliver or give to others. Jesus had asked her for physical water, but he had offered to her living water, water that will quench her deepest thirst. And if her desire truly was for love, then is this not what he is offering her at the well? Not a physical love, but a spiritual love, a deeper kind of love than the experiences that she had had up until this point. A love that is living and that will not run out or give up or die away. A lasting, eternal love. This woman seems in this conversation to be pretty wise and on top of things. And I sense that she knows that this conversation is not just about surface water, but it's about something deeper. And so she presses him theologically. Yeah, that might be nice. I mean, love is nice, but what about our differences? Samaritans and Jews worship God differently and in different places, despite our mutual connection with Jacob as our forefathers. What about those differences? And Jesus responds that it is not only in the physical that God is present, but in spirit and in a truth that is deeper than any kind of outward, superficial differences we may have with one another. It is deeper than gender, it is deeper than ability, it is deeper than any kind of geography. And the Samaritan woman, who knows, probably too likely, how well these kind of differences can divide us, states that she is aware that one day the Messiah will come and he will unite all things and all people back together. And it's here that we get that mic drop moment. So if you missed it, Jesus replies to her in response to the Messiah, I am he. Saying, I am the Messiah. Now, he may have wanted to hold off on saying that until he got his water, because now, as soon as he said that, she's off and running. She goes back home to her village to tell people, come and meet the man who told me the truth about myself. He claims he is the Messiah, and the people go out and they believe. They believe not just because of her testimony, but because of the words that he speaks to them. These words were probably words of the truth of God's love that is deep and as wide as the ocean. A love that truly is for the entire world and does not condemn. And we know that this love will become visible for all when Jesus is finally lifted up on that cross for all to see, sacrificing himself in love so that we may, in our imperfections, be invited to come and be reconciled to God. Now, circling back to that restaurant that I visited, I was curious. And so when I got home that night, I had to look this place up. And I found out that it was called Imperfect because the restaurant incorporates imperfect produce to support farmers purchasing food that otherwise would not have gone to market. And they pass these savings on to the consumers. And they do so without sacrificing nutrition or taste because, as we all know, there is no difference in taste between an imperfect potato and a perfect one. Food is food, just like humans are humans. The perfection of God's love is very similar. Jesus has the ability to take all that is imperfect about it, whether it's imperfect on the outside, as with the Samaritan woman, or imperfect on the inside, as with Nicodemus. And he transforms all by his love, making us all acceptable and delightful to the Father. So it turns out even that fast food restaurant knew that it is what is beyond the surface that truly matters. In our scriptures, we give thanks that God is love, and God sees us through all our imperfections and calls us all to himself to make us new. Thanks be to God. Amen.